Now here is our verse for today. Shri Shuka Uvacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agada Bodham Maitreya Asinam Agadha Bodham Kshato Pashrit Yachuta Bhava Siddha Kshato Pashrit Yachuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Shaushila Guna Bitrip Papricha Sausila Guna Bitripta Shri Shuka Uvacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agada Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Saushila Guna Bitripta Shri Shuka Uvacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agadha Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Shaushila Guna Bitripta Shri Shuka Uvacha Varidyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agadha Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Shaushila Guna Bitripta Shri Shuka Uvacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agada Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha Prapacha Shaushila Guna Bitripta Shri Shuka Uvacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agadha Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Shaushila Guna Bitripta. Ladies. Shri Shuka Uvacha Varidyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agadha Bodham Kshato Pashrityachuta Bhava Siddha papracha shoshila guna bitripta. All right, so the translation reads, Shukadeva Goswami said, Vidura, the best among the Kuru dynasty, who was perfect in devotional service to the Lord, thus reached the source of the celestial Ganges river, Hardwar, where Maitreya, the great fathomless learned sage of the world, was seated. Vidura, who was perfect in gentleness and satisfied in transcendence, inquired from him. So I say, and you please repeat. Shukadeva Goswami said, Vidura, the best amongst the Kuru dynasty, who was perfect in devotional service to the Lord, thus reached the source of the celestial Ganges river, Hardwar, where Maitreya, the great, fathomless learned sage of the world, was seated. Vidura, who was perfect in gentleness and satisfied in transcendence, inquired from him. Okay, so here is Prabhupada's purport. Vidura was already perfect due to his unalloyed devotion to the infallible Lord. The Lord and the living entities are all qualitatively the same by nature, but the Lord is quantitatively much greater than any individual living entity. He is ever infallible, whereas the living entities are prone to fall under the illusory energy. Vidura had already surpassed the fallible nature of the living entities in conditional life due to his being achyuta bhava, or legitimately absorbed in the devotional service of the Lord. This stage of life is called achyuta bhava siddha, or perfection by dint of devotional service. Anyone, therefore, who is absorbed in the devotional service of the Lord is a liberated soul and has all admirable qualities. The learned sage Maitreya was sitting in a solitary place on the banks of the Ganges at Hardwar, and Vidura, who was a perfect devotee of the Lord and possessed all good transcendental qualities, approached him for inquiry. Shri Shuka Ubacha Dvaridyo Nadya Rishabha Kurunam Maitreyam Asinam Agada Bodham Kshatopashritya Chuta Bhava Siddha Papracha Shaushila Guna Bitriptaha. Sukadeva Goswami said, Vidura, the best among the Kuru dynasty, who was perfect in devotional service to the Lord, thus reached the source of the celestial Ganges river, Hardwar, where Maitreya, the great fathomless learned sage of the world, was seated. Vidura, who was perfect in gentleness and satisfied in transcendence, inquired from him. So we are following the progress or the journey of two, or maybe we could say three individuals here. Not much is really focused in on Maitreya, although he'll be the person who's actually speaking. We learned earlier that we have Uddhava, who looks exactly like Krishna, but Uddhava meets Krishna in Dvarka, his capital city, and there Krishna reveals that soon he's wrapping up his pastimes. He's going to be leaving the mundane material world after 125 years here in the earth plane. Krishna will be leaving, and this disturbs Uddhava, but Uddhava wants to actually, learns something from Krishna. So Krishna speaks many things, and that's a whole section known as the Uddhava Gita, which is later on in Bhagavatam. And then Krishna instructs Uddhava to go to Bhadarika, where Krishna has not had the opportunity. He did many things during the 125 years that he was here in this mundane plane, but he never got around to meeting the devotees at Bhadarika there in the Himalayas, where it's very cold. So he tells Vidura to go there. Vidura departs to go there, but right after that, Krishna calls the elders of Dwarka city and explains that unfortunate, inauspicious things are happening, and they should all purify themselves by going to Prabhasa Kshetra. So they do that. They leave and they go to Prabhasa Kshetra. Krishna, Balaram, and all the elders, the residents of Dwarka, the Yadus for that matter, for the most part. Let's see if we can do this without getting what I did last week with I'm afraid of this. I don't want to get the rasping sound on the microphone again like I did last week. So, at any rate, Vidura, no, not Vidura, but Uddhava, he is hearing that Krishna wants him to go to Bhadarika. He's on the way. But at Prabhasa Kshetra, the Yadus, they all come together. They perform some austerities, and then, as we know, they drink rice wine. And Satyaki insults Kritavarman, and that turns into a brawl. Not only a brawl, but it turns into a death brawl where all of them kill each other, except for Krishna and Balaram are left remaining after that. And Krishna's charioteer, Daruka, so he tells Daruka to go fetch Arjuna. And after the death of all the Yadu dynasty, which was predicted, and it was a curse by Gandhari, and it was also another curse too. But at any rate, I don't want to get too far into other stories. But when everybody is dead, Balaram leaves the material world, but Krishna is still left behind. And at that point, Uddhava doubles back. Instead of going to Bhadarika like he was told by Krishna, he comes back. And there he meets Krishna. And as he meets Krishna, it's just before Krishna is getting ready to leave the material world. So Krishna is resting under a peepala tree, or in some places it's an ashavada tree. And he's got his four-armed form. And at that moment, when Uddhava approaches Krishna, just before Krishna leaves, Maitreya shows up. So Maitreya is able to hear the last discourses that Krishna has with anyone in this material world with Uddhava, and he remembers them. And then Uddhava goes his way, Krishna leaves the planet, and Maitreya goes his way. Now, apparently, we see that Vidura has been on a pilgrimage as well. This is the other person involved. So Vidura left the court of Hastinapur when he was insulted by Duryodhana, and he began a long, long pilgrimage, traveling many places. He finally wound up in the Vrindavan area on the bank of the Jamuna at Gurgaon. And that's where he met Uddhava. So Vidura met Uddhava at Gurgaon. And this is where this particular episode is taking place, where Uddhava tells Vidura to go and meet Maitreya. So that's what we just did in the last chapter, that, Maitreya is supposed to instruct Vidura, because he was older, as is so Vidura. And of course this is kind of interesting, because what are they hearing about? Uddhava is a perfected soul, Vidura is a perfected soul, and Maitreya is a perfected soul. So it seems like, what's the point? If you want to learn something, you want to learn something you don't know, and you learn from a teacher who knows something you don't. But this is what we learn from that famous verse, the Atmaram verse, that even perfected people want to hear about Krishna. Even those who are perfected, they want to hear about Krishna. Why? Because by hearing about the Supreme Lord, we become gradually freed from all contamination. We learn what's actually going on in this very strange material world that we live in, with all of its quirks and weirdnesses. So we have the material world, we live in it, and gradually as we learn what's really going on here, instead of what people think is going on here, then we learn that it's like a virtual reality, a big game. And it has pious activities and sinful activities. And by performing sinful activities, you will in the future suffer. And by performing pious activities in the future, you'll enjoy. But both are traps, because the material world is not where we want to be. We want to be in the spiritual world, which also has people, it also has activity, it also has emotions and relationships, but they are not the same as the ones here in this world. And to go there, we have to be purified. We have to be fully focused on the Supreme Lord. Otherwise, we would not be happy there, and they would not want us there. So that's the nature of devotional service. We learn through doing bhakti yoga, or devotional service, how to purify ourselves. So we are actually, not just theoretically, but we actually want to serve the Supreme Lord 24/7 at all times. And we have a sense of what it is to serve the Supreme Lord. It's not some guesswork thing, not some abstraction. It's something quite tangible. And we call that devotional service. And we hear that in the prelude to this segment, where we begin to hear Maitreya speaking and answering questions of Vidura, the Vidura first asks about actual devotional service, various basic things. And later he will hear about the actual intimate pastimes of the Supreme Lord. So he will, and this is also a strategy that's there in the Bhagavatam. We have 9 entire cantos explaining who in the world this Krishna is. What is God like from a philosophical point of view? We hear what he does, how he works, how the universe is created, the energies, karma. We hear about reincarnation. We hear about the 3 modes of nature. We hear about the various sages, how the whole universe was populated. We hear all that stuff. And then finally we get around to this little boy playing around, and his mother is coming after him with a whipping stick. Which is interesting. That first stanza of the Damodarastakam, that the supreme controller, who is the source of all the universes, is running in fear of his mother with a whipping stick, which sounds like the craziest thing you could ever possibly hear. From a philosophical point of view, from a religious point of view, here is the origin of the entire universe and everyone in it and everything from time immemorial and things outside of the material universe. And he is running because he's afraid his mother is going to whip him with a whipping stick. You think, wait a minute, that sounds really out there. But then we're prepared for it because we've heard 9 cantos about how the Supreme Lord, like a player on a stage, takes various roles. And in the roles, he has supporting people, his devotees. And through the interaction he has with his devotees, he brings out various emotions and relationships with him. And they enjoy and he enjoys. And this is what the universe is really all about. It's these beautiful pastimes, as Satyavrata Muni says, the cheeks of his blackish, the cheeks of his face are reddened like bimba fruit with the black curling hair coming down. What more can I describe than this? I pray that this vision constantly appear in my heart. So he's a philosopher, but he's just wanting to relish this pastime. So there, as we know, different moods. Some devotees are in relationship with Krishna in one mood, some are in relationship with Krishna in a different mood. And what we are going to find out is that in this new chapter that we just broke into today, chapter 5, this is the first verse of chapter 5 in Canto 3, we are going to hear about how Vidura will inquire from Maitreya. That will go on through verses 1 through about 18, and from 19, or actually 16, and from 17 to 38, Maitreya will describe the process of creation. But we've already heard about the process of creation. We're going to hear some more about it from a slightly different angle. So we heard about that in, Canto 2, and now we're going to hear about it again, this time from Maitreya. And we are going to later, after from 17 to 38, from 39 to 51, we're going to hear the prayers of the demigods. How did the demigods get into this all of a sudden? We've got Vidura, and we've got Maitreya, and Vidura is asking questions about the, creation of the universe. And then Maitreya is answering those questions, and suddenly we're hearing about the demigods. Well, the thing is that in the explanation of the creation of the universe, there's a stage where the demigods are created. And where the demigods are created, then at that stage is where Maitreya begins to tell us about the prayers of the demigods, because the demigods do not know what they're supposed to do exactly. Just like we hear Lord Brahma, he's unaware, although he's born on the lotus flower, and he sees only darkness around him, and he's wondering, what's going on here? What is this place? And he's mystified, and then eventually, through his tapa, through his penance, he learns what the universe is and how it's his duty to create it. So Brahma has the tools, the energies necessary. They come from the Supreme Lord, but it's his business to be the engineer. Oh, Brahma's the first engineer. And then Brahma sets about to create the universe, and then he gets an even more tough assignment. After creating the universe, he has to populate it. And so we get into this whole idea of the Prajapatis. How does he populate the universe? And things don't go well for him right away at the beginning, as we know. Lord Brahma, he creates the 4 Kumaras, and he says, oh, now you can create children. And they go, They don't want to create children. So Brahma gets angry, but he controls his anger. And then Shiva appears. And then he tells Shiva to create progeny. And Shiva's happy to do it, but he creates these ghosts and demoniac types, and they start tearing up the universe. The universe hasn't even been fully created, and they're already destroying it. And so Brahma says, well, Shiva, please just sit down and meditate. Let's think of something else. This isn't working out. And then eventually, other Prajapatis come, and the whole universe gets populated. You have the various wives of what's his name? Was it? No, not Swayambhuva Manu, but we had Diti and Aditi. Who is their husband? Kasyap Muni. Why couldn't I remember that? Okay, Kasyap Muni. So Kasyap Muni is the person who has various wives, and they, although they're women, but they are not normal women. They are demigoddesses. So they give birth to various species that do not resemble them. There's one that gives birth to all the plants, one that gives birth to the birds, one that gives birth to various kinds of animals, one that gives birth to insects, all these various things. So this is how eventually the universe becomes populated with various kinds of creatures in various types of bodies. So this is kind of how the universe unfolds. Now, what's the purpose of this universe? This is the most important thing. The purpose of this universe is to give us choice, that we can stay here if we want. No one's forcing us to leave. We can stay here. We can stay here as long as we want. As long as we think there's something here worth having, wealth, fame, knowledge, strength, beauty, as long as we're after these opulences of the material world, we can stay here. But one day, one fine day, somehow or other, we bump into a devotee or something happens, we realize this is stupid. I'm living all these years and I try to enjoy it, but mostly I'm bored and I suffer, but I get a little bit of enjoyment. There's a few raisins in there that taste sweet, but the rest of it is like a poop salad, in the material world. It's not a nice or a happy thing at all. It's kind of a terrible place. And we see, people suffering, we see wars, we see famines, we see abuse, we see violence, we see, people doing horrible things, and the environment being destroyed. We see all this stuff. And then we get a few little, raisins of happiness here and there every once in a while. And usually we think, hey, look at that, a raisin of happiness. Now I'm good for the next 2 years, And then we go through more. One of these days we wake up to the fact, this is stupid. And some devotee says, yeah, you're right, it's stupid. You want to get out? I'll tell you how. And this is just exactly what Vidura is asking Maitreya, how do we get out of this mess? And the answer is simple: by devotional service. We learn how to serve God. And eventually we begin to realize that the things of this world come and go. It's got its good points, its bad points. We've got the times where things seem to be working out for us, the times where things are really not going well for us, the times where people think we're something special, the time people couldn't care less if we live or die, the times that, the salad days, the creeping through the barbed wire under crossfire, all those kinds of things are happening to us. So, but it's just a virtual reality. It's coming and going. And then we die, and mostly we take birth again in a new body, in a new place, a new country, new parents, and go through the whole thing all over again. But we don't remember it because the material energy wipes our memory clean. And so we do it again and again and again and again so forth. How long do we want to do this? How long do we want to do this? We can go on doing it forever until one day we discover that devotional service is actually what satisfies the heart. It's what makes us attractive to other people in a way that's actually meaningful. And eventually it gets us out of here and we go back and we can play games with the Supreme Lord. Like we were hearing about yesterday, our Pancharatna was telling us about how to cry for the Lord. So we learn how to cry when we actually experience real emotions for the first time, in a real relationship for the first time with the Supreme. And that's all kind of beyond our ability to grasp right now. We have emotions, we have relationships, we do these things, but they're all, on a kind of a really low level, and they only partly satisfy us. But instead, we find that relationships have these abusive edges to them. People are exploiting us, we're exploiting them. And things go south, things fade out, we go from one thing to another. And so that's the nature of the material world. But this doesn't happen in the spiritual world. But there we have to be actually unselfishly focused and motivated on the Supreme Lord, which is not an easy thing, but we can get there through devotional service. So there's, as I was reading through all this stuff, I just came up with way too much stuff to talk about. So I was going to branch out into one of two areas, but one of the main problems is that as devotees, we're reaching out to people in the actual everyday world. But people in the everyday world, they look at this Bhagavatam or the things that we're saying, and they wonder, where are these guys living under a rock or something like that? It's 2021, where do these guys come from, what don't they know that all this stuff is mythology and all this kind of thing? But I think to be able to penetrate through to the everyday world and to the people that we actually meet out there in the everyday world, it's good, I think, at least if we know, maybe we can get it across to them, maybe we can't. But if we know that there's a reason why people believe what they believe, today. We have a mythology in the 21st century just like they had, in the second millennium BC, or what they had, in the 15th century or the 12th century. We also have a modern mythology. And we don't actually understand where it came from. If we look back at human society, if we kind of go forward step by step, I'll give you a nickel tour of the modern world and how we came to believe the things that we believe, with science and, so on and so forth. For the biggest portion of human history, people basically followed some religious or spiritual idea. The world was mysterious. There were apparently magical things going on in it. And sometimes people worshiped the Supreme Lord. Sometimes they ignored the Supreme Lord. And the explanation of things was either there was a Supreme Lord or there were multiple beings or something like that with some powers or something like that. And a lot of things didn't exactly make sense, but there was no way to understand much about them. So people got sick, we didn't know why that happened exactly, and so on and so forth. And this lasted for a long, long time. And at a certain point in history, at least the Western history of Europe, we're going to just talk about that, because that's the biggest imprint on modern thinking in our modern world. It comes from a European centric point of view. So from that, we had people that decided, wait a minute, all this stuff about religion, we hear this, we hear that, there was, with Christianity, it pushed out this idea that we don't want to talk about demigods, they don't exist, there's only one God, because that same idea had been there from Judaism, that there's only a single God. So we call this monotheism, the idea that there's one main being. And we are not monotheists, we are henotheists, which means we realize there's one being, but we also understand that there are other beings who are his departmental heads that run the universe, and they are called demigods. And, these demigods were there. The Greeks worshipped them, the Romans worshipped them. In Scandinavia, they worshipped them. In the little islands out in the Pacific, they worshipped them. In Africa, they worshipped them. In China, they worshipped them. The American Indians worshipped them. So here is this thing that was all over the world, this understanding of these various demigods that we'll be talking about. And so, as I put it, whatever our ancestors were smoking, they were buying it from the same dealer, So it's the idea that somehow or other this idea of demigods was not a European idea. It was an idea that was all over the world. Every culture had it. And of course now we don't think about it. So partly that was due to Judaism, and then later Christianity pushed it all in the background. And then Christianity had a very strong focus in Europe, and it broke into pieces with the Protestant Revolution in 16th century or 15th century, whenever that was, around the same time as Lord Chaitanya was performing his pastimes in Bengal. And then eventually people got tired of hearing things that made no philosophical sense. So we were entering the Enlightenment, as it was called, where people wanted to hear a reasonable explanation of the world around us, one that made some kind of logical sense. And there was this faith that one day just reason alone would help us to understand everything in the world around us. And then there was the rise of philosophers. We had the German school, the English school, and they fought it out about different things, and nobody actually won. It was a battle where you just had philosophers, guys over here, you've got the empiricists, and you've got the other schools with their different theories. And it wasn't like one theory was so right that the others said, all right, we're going to throw this all out. Everybody was kind of still there. And so people realized that reason wasn't going to really come around to anything. And then there was this rise of science that, okay, let's put all this philosophical junk out of our minds. Let's get down to science. We can do experiments, Isaac Newton and, later on other scientists. And this brings us around to finally the big cherry on the top, which was the Vienna school, the logical positivists. And they were going to prove what was actually going on in the world through science. And we're going to throw out all this, religion, because it's all just mythology. We're going to throw out even philosophy, because it's all just people haggling with one another. Nobody can come to any conclusions. So we're going to throw it all out. And these logical positivists came up with logical positivism. And this was around the time of the Second World War, so Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, and most of them had to leave, and some of them were killed. But at any rate, what happened after that was they really talked up a good thing. They were going to say that anything that could not be verified with the senses was just humbug, it didn't exist. People really were onto this, But little by little, everything they tried to prove fell apart, which is the strange part about it. Nobody knows this unless you actually read the history of our culture. So, these were people like Moritz Schlick, Hans Hahn, Otto Neurath and his wife Olga Neurath, and these various people, the logical positivists. They wanted to put forward the idea that only science had meaning. Everything was meaningless. If you talked philosophy or you talked religion, you might as well just be singing a song because it didn't mean anything to how the world really was, And they were going to put this out. And so the verification hypothesis was their main thing. But a few years passed, and eventually everything they tried to establish fell apart. That you can't establish things on science alone. And we come back to a universe where we don't really know what's going on. We wish we did, but magic is still there. It never died or went anywhere. It's still lurking around in the recesses on the far edges of what we see. We want to get rid of it, but we can't exactly. We want to know how things really are, but we never get a good look at them, and things are complicated, and things just get, these guys are saying that, and those guys are saying this, and which is it really, so A.J. Ayer said it the best about logical positivism. He was asked on a television program, what was it that was the main fault of logical positivism? And he said, well, the main fault of it was that largely it was all wrong. Everything was wrong about it. But it was right in spirit. So this is what people don't know, that there was a time when people really tried to make a good go at basing the entire world on mathematics and on logic and on reason and on science, and it fizzled. But today, most people never study that history and they don't know anything about it, so they don't realize that it never worked out. It's just the way the world is. We can't learn these things through... Science certainly does know things, there's no doubt about it. Science comes to conclusions, but these conclusions never get down to the philosophical level where we really want to know about things. How did they get this way? How did humans first evolve? What is the purpose of the world that we live in? Does it go on like this forever? Is it like this everywhere? What is the real nature of time? We don't know the answers to these questions, People certainly speculate a lot about them, and scientists talk about them, and you got the talking heads of so many different types. But we don't get real answers. So we're back again. And we're talking about one kind of universe, and a lot of people are living in this modern world, which was this gradual progression of a religious overview, a somewhat mysterious, superstitious point of view. Then we have, the rational point of view, and then finally the scientific point of view. And none of these points of view really give us the whole picture. But when we read Bhagavatam, we have the one thing that does tie it all together. Why we're here, why this world is so squirrely in so many different ways, and what to do about it. And this is actually what we're going to hear from Maitreya as he explains it. First of all, he'll talk about creation, then we'll hear about the demigods, and then other things that'll come about here. And so this is discussion within a discussion within a discussion. So the Bhagavatam starts out with Vyasadeva speaking, and then we hear the sages at Naimisharanya, and they're talking about, so Vyasadeva's talking about the sages at Naimisharanya. Then the sages at Naimisharanya are talking about what Sukadeva Goswami and Parikshit are saying. And Parikshit and Sukadeva Goswami are talking about this conversation between Vidura and Maitreya. So it's kind of, like a dream within a dream within a dream. So we have these nested communications, because this is the technique of spiritual life. We're not dreaming up something new. And, you'll see this over and over in the Bhagavatam, that somebody says something, and actually the question you have raised is a very wonderful question. And indeed, Lord Brahma at the beginning of the universe did discuss this question with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is what they said. So this is the technique of how it works. So you get these nested conversations. And so here we are hearing, as we see it, it says Sukadeva Goswami said. So Sukadeva is talking to who? He's talking to Parikshit. And they're talking about what? Vidura talking with Maitreya. And in what context is Sukadeva Goswami talking to Parikshit? We're hearing about that because Sukadeva Goswami is speaking to the sages at Naimisharanya. And this is all Vyasadeva telling us that, so that we're zooming back out all these different levels. So, anyway, I've spoken too long. Any quick questions or comments? I don't want to drag you all beyond breakfast and gain all of your hatred. Yes.
What are the deepest scientific myths in our modern society?
What's that?
What are the deepest scientific myths, like people that, like things that people accept factual in science, which are actually
not real,
not clear,
Right. Well, I think it starts very simply with the idea that there are laws of nature. And those laws of nature are based on mathematical formulae, So that's where you can start. Can it be proved that the laws of nature are always the same everywhere and at all times? Can anyone actually prove that? We can say that certainly they do hold sway most of the time, otherwise airplanes would fall out of the skies. Of course, sometimes they do anyway, but, we could say that, but we don't know for a fact that F equals ma or E equals mc squared if we go out in the recesses of the universe far away. We don't know it's always been like that. We don't know that the speed of light has always been, 300,000 miles per second, or 3,000 kilometers per second. I'm sorry, got the wrong units there. So we don't know those things have always been that way. And this brings me around to the basic theme of materialistic science. There are scientists that aren't materialistic, don't get me wrong, but there are some who definitely are, and they're the big talking heads that push it forward in our society today. So this idea is that they have absolute faith in the law, but they don't accept the lawmaker. We're exactly the other way around. We accept the lawmaker, but not the laws, because he can change the laws if he likes. There's nothing to say that, Krishna generally does allow the laws of physics to work the way they do, all those different things that we see, If you go to college and you study engineering, you learn just boatloads of the stuff, Kirchhoff's law, and P equals IE, and F equals MA, and the various things that, the equations of electromagnetism by James Maxwell Clark, all those kinds of things. You learn those, and they work to some extent, and we don't doubt that they're foundational in some way. But do they always work? And do they always work the way we think they do? Newton's F equals ma. With, Einstein, we now see that you have to add relativistic factors into the whole picture, because F equals ma breaks down as you approach the speed of light. You have to add something else in it. So this is the way all the material laws work. There's a scientist whose name is, what's his name? Maybe it'll come to me in a minute, who talks about this quite a lot, It's interesting that he lived in India for many years, and Rupert Sheldrake, that's who I'm trying to pull to mind, who has a book that describes the great myths of science. He says that there are about, I think 10 of them or something like that. Great things that all scientists believe, but they certainly can't be proved. They're just philosophical positions. And philosophical positions, as we were saying before, you can go quite a ways with them, but you can never actually absolutely prove them. Krishna makes the material world so you can never just slam dunk something and say this is the way it is and prove it to everybody. You can prove it to yourself, but you can't prove it to everybody. So that's the issue here. And I think he calls, what is the book, 10 myths of science. I forget what the name of the book. At any rate, he talks about it a lot, that these are where science talks a big bluff, but you can't get beyond that, So if we learn about them, then we can also begin to help people recognize that science is there, it's useful, there's nothing bad about it, we don't hate it, but it doesn't tell us about our world in very many important ways that we want to know about it. So this is where, whenever you're talking about Bhagavatam, sometimes you have to go there, because does the person think that you're living under a rock for the last 20 years, or you believe that the earth is flat, and you believe that, that all these things are what they are, So, anyway, yeah.
It brought me to a second question.
What's that?
It brought me to a second question.
Yeah.
I remember before I became Hare Krishna, before I knew what the Hare Krishnas, I was reading actually Rupert Sheldrake.
Oh, Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah, I was reading his books, and I was reading also others like Bruce Lipton, and I think there's a whole bunch of
Right.
those, scientists who are trying to, they're like real scientists that try to
Right.
really break through those myths. But after becoming a Hare Krishna, actually I stopped reading any of that, and I was wondering what's the position, can I just pick them up also and read them again?
Well, I think that if you're if you're trying to reach people in the modern world, especially young people, they're going to ask those questions, or at least if they don't ask them, they're in the back of their minds. I think all of us, came from a background like that. I was in electronic engineering in college, so Sadaputta, he was also coming from a completely scientific background. And now here you're in a place where you're reading that the Supreme Lord is running from his mother's whipping stick. And we're hearing about the demigods and this thing. Are we in the 21st century, or are we in 3000 BC? Which is it, And the answer is that the picture that the Bhagavatam gives us actually is closer to explaining the weird nature of this world that we actually see. Scientists just shove so much stuff in the garbage can, that it's stuff that's obviously there, people, ghosts, for instance, the actual mainstream science view of ghosts is there ain't no such thing. But so many people experience ghosts, UFOs, so many people see them, but according to mainstream science, they don't exist, astral travel, or clairvoyance, or premonitions, all these things, ESP, they're all things that according to mainstream science don't exist. They can't exist. Why? Because it doesn't fit in their equations, But there's so many people in the world who've had these experiences directly that you can't just say that they were all crazy, So the Bhagavatam view does take all those things in. We have a place for every one of these phenomenon, and it's explained in somewhere in Bhagavatam, but it's not explained in science books. Instead, you get this stone wall that this stuff doesn't exist, it can't exist, it shouldn't exist, etc., etc. So I think in our preaching, we have to some extent, be able to give people a 21st century understanding of why, in the modern world, we believe things like this, because we think the material world is a virtual reality. It's not what it appears to be. It appears to be solid, but it's actually not. In fact, some scientists think like that. Max Tegmark, for instance, and there are others who have the idea that, it looks solid, and for the most part it is, but every once in a while you get into those weird areas, you realize that this world is doing things that just don't make sense, I think the biggest evidence of the material world being fake is Sankirtan. When you're out and you're distributing books and people are buying a Bhagavad Gita like one after another, I mean, what are the odds that would happen? You're selling a book that's so esoteric most people have never heard of it, much less it's a religious kind of book, Yet, there are times where suddenly one after another a person comes up and buys a Bhagavad Gita, and for some reason they give you the money and you give them the Bhagavad Gita and they're on their way. Of course, there are times where you go through periods of time where no one will even look at you. That's there too, But sometimes that works like that. If there isn't a God, and it isn't, and Krishna is not doing something which is warping the laws of statistics in some drastic way, how would it happen? And I think most people who have ever done any book distribution have had those experiences. What are the odds of having like 20 or 30 people in the same area come up and be interested in the Bhagavad Gita within the space of 2 hours or something like that? What are the odds? They're like 2 billion to 1 or something like that. If you were selling, iPhones or something, it's a different story. People all over the city or all over the world have heard of iPhones, and they have their understanding of why they're desirable and this and that and the other. But, there's a lot of spooky things going on in this world. And spiritual life is what actually brings it all out, it brings it all out. And if you look close, you begin to realize that the stuff the scientists talk about, it's there. There's no doubt about it. F usually does equal ma. The speed of light is, whatever it is, 186,000 miles per second or 300,000 kilometers per second or whatever it is. So at any rate, you have these different things. And they do hold up for the most part. Krishna has the laws of nature and he lets them do their thing. But once in a while, if he wants to, he changes them. And then he changes them back if he wants to, because he's the law maker. We believe in the law giver who makes the laws, and he can change them. And there are places where the laws don't apply, like the spiritual world. That's places where those laws don't apply. All right, so at any rate, I should cap it off here. So I thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hari Bol.